And we're live. It is Thursday, May 21st, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Boris Johnson has escaped a criminal inquiry over Jennifer R. Curry, whoever she may be, reports The Guardian. Kim Jong-un, of course, is beyond criminal scrutiny under any circumstances. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have a very special guest today who is currently being raptured into the show. Reginald Dwayne Betts.
Hey, Dwayne.
Welcome.
There you are.
Cool. What's going on? Oh man, so much sun.
Hey, friend.
How's
It's so
it going?
good to see your face.
Yeah, man, I haven't seen you in a minute.
I know. Do you have a drink? Good boy. What are we all drinking? Oh, sorry. I'll introduce you, but first, what are you drinking, Dwayne?
Yeah,
Whiskey.
Yeah, what kind of whiskey?
Yeah, what kind of whiskey? It's like I can't even remember the name of it because I'm trying it for the first time. It's like Ali Miss. I'd never tried it before actually. It's supposed to be close
All
to
right.
it's supposed to be close to Lefroy. The guy convinced me that I should try it.
And where are you? Are you in like where geographically are you?
New Haven.
New Haven, Connecticut. All right. And how is COVID life in New Haven?
I guess it's the same as everywhere, but New Haven, it depends on where you live actually, and probably which is the same as everywhere. But I live somewhere that's a little less dense, so I can get outside, take a walk, take a bike ride, live close to a bike trail. So it sort of feels like probably like 1875. You know what I mean? Closest neighbors is like 5 miles away. You know, and I don't like them that much. That's kind of what it feels like. And the school stuff is crazy because I got young kids, but outside of that, I think we managing pretty well.
Well, we should talk about that in a second, but let me introduce you. Well, Ben, you gave the spiel, so I'm going to introduce Dwayne.
Go for it.
Dwayne he's a friend of mine, and we are both in the Yale PhD in law program together, which is how we kind of met when we were both at YLS. But Dwayne is and has kind of an unbelievable story and an unbelievable resume. I was just actually texting you and telling you that it was very intimidating to look at your bio. You're a Guggenheim Fellow, National Endowment of the Arts Fellow in 2018. You won a magazine, an American Magazine award for your reporting or your story. I don't know if it was reporting, like your story in the New York Times Magazine. The one that you complained about writing for forever, and I had sympathy for because I understand that.
It took forever to write. It was good though.
It was good, and you have you have published 2 books of poetry, 1 book, 2 books, Felon, and what else?
3, Felon, Shaheed reads his own poem, and Bastards of the Reagan Era.
Okay, awesome. And then, and you have a JD from Yale. You've worked as a public defender. You've worked as a clerk, federal clerk. You have just kind of this incredible resume, and now you're just like a man about town in New Haven, writing and doing things. And every once in a while, I urge you to finish your PhD, and then tell you don't need to finish your PhD, and you're kind of okay.
I'm a finish. I got a motto of education that means, you should take your time and finish where you want. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
So let's start with the story behind all that, because I think a lot of people who are watching it probably don't know it. It's a story that you told at length in that New York Times Magazine piece, but you're not the typical Yale JD PhD candidate. What's your story?
Yeah, I guess typical. I don't know. It might depend on who you ask, but I think probably most.
Yeah, I kind of think that Yale is full of felons, but whatever.
No, I wasn't gonna say that. I was gonna say that I was actually gonna say that like it's interesting because the way we characterize ourselves and the way we let others characterize us frequently has more power than whatever the details of history end up being. And it is a way in which like the people who end up at Yale are far more similar than they like to admit. Like really, like anal and obsessed and willing to spend an inordinate amount of time on themselves, an inordinate amount of time on their own like education. But then you got the group of people that end up in those institutions that are like really committed and really dedicated and have a wide range of interests, so like I mean it's just weird. So I think I don't know, I think I try to acknowledge some of that tension when I think about what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and how I got to where I am. But sort of to answer your question, just to back all the way up, what is it, like May 21st or something? So I every year around this time I think that it's weird. I got sentenced to prison. This is probably why I keep going to school. When I was 17, that's when I got sentenced to prison. I got locked up when I was 16, but I got sentenced when I was 17 on May 16th. And I think that one of the reasons why I stay in school is because every graduation is an opportunity to displace the memory of standing before a judge and being sent to prison. But I went to prison for carjacking when I was 16. Me and a friend of mine, we carjacked somebody, got caught the next day. In Virginia, carjacking carries life. And so it's this weird way in which we think about crime and punishment and about accountability. And we talk about it in really abstract ways, but because I went through it myself, I think about the ways in which the law is very exacting in how it thinks about punishment and how it thinks about violence. And it's exacting in a way in which our public conversations don't acknowledge. And so maybe we can't move to where we need to go because we don't acknowledge that I could sit here before you as a Yale graduate, Yale law graduate, or a PhD candidate from Yale. I wrote 4 books. I could sit in front of you as all of those things. But also when I was 16, I faced a life sentence, which means that I can sit in front of you as a father, as a husband, as a basketball coach in the community. I can sit in front of you as like multiple things. And yet when I was 16, I faced a life sentence, which meant that a judge had in his power, right, to say that you have no possibility to be any of those things. And there's a certain kind of absurdity to that. But I went in when I was 16 and to fast forward, close the door, Makai. Sorry. So that's the thing you got to do on Zoom to make people know that it's real. You got to talk to your children or they don't really exist.
Yeah, no, I'm totally for that. And on in lieu of fun, we're
Dogs
super
interrupt.
casual. So
Yeah.
But yeah, so I got, so to fast forward it, I got sentenced to the 9 years in prison, did 8.5, and became a writer while I was inside, and became a
and
poet
where
when I
was
was
this? Where were you? Where were you?
Virginia.
In Virginia?
Yeah, Virginia. From Maryland, robbed somebody in Virginia, and did my time in Virginia.
Uh-huh.
And then came home and did a bunch of other stuff, and ended up at Yale Law School.
Can you
So
tell people? Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
I have another just absurdity to ask you. You've just described an absurdity. But I have another one, which is you're a JD from Yale,
Mhm.
and you've got a felony background, and Rudy Giuliani is also a lawyer, lawyer for the President of the United States. And one of you had trouble being a member of the bar, and it wasn't Rudy Giuliani. And that seems to me a bit of an absurdity. Because one of you is sort of operating a kind of is participating in an ongoing criminal enterprise, and it ain't you.
That's what I was about to say. It all depends on.
Interested for your reflections on that.
It all depends on when you run your criminal enterprise. You see, if you run it after you've been a lawyer, right? After you graduated from law school, after you got licensed, then it's a little bit more leeway. And it's funny though, right? Because like the way we think about people's credibility and the way we think about the way in which their actions comport with what we imagine to be the law shifts just because of what your identity is before you started committing those crimes, right? And so Giuliani has a kind of veneer. It's almost like every year of his life since law school has put another coat of veneer over who we imagine that he is. And that happens in society all the time. And so by the time that he like does something, he commits a crime or commits something that's ostensibly a crime or does something that would get me disbarred if I was doing it, right? Because he's developed like these layers and layers and layers and layers of protection over his entire life, like we act as if we don't see it. But I think the same things could be said for, a lot of people who operate dominantly in the public space. And those are things that when I was 16, nobody was thinking about me in that way, right? Like nobody was saying this is going to be a loss to society in this way. And we talk about Rudy Giuliani, but we could easily be talking about Bill Clinton and very much like not the exact same way, but we could talk about the way in which Bill Clinton has done things that I think around like mass incarceration, thinking about his trilogy of bills, that he developed a kind of veneer that not only like keeps him from being criticized for that, but actually keeps us from even mentioning those things in relationship to him. So I think that it's a product of the way in which we, we make men into giants and then get mad when they crush us.
I love that. But there's like, so we've talked about this before, but I don't want to get like super like kind of corny and in the times and quote like Lin-Manuel Miranda and like Hamilton and stuff. But there's this one moment that I actually really think is so understated, even though it's like a whole song, but it's still kind of understated. I don't think people really think about it, like, which is the line like, who lives, who dies, who tells your story. And this idea that we have about legacy and understanding people's stories becomes this linear narrative through time and through a single storyteller or history or whatever. And everything kind of gets washed or becomes kind of like this one thing in which like Bill Clinton or Alexander Hamilton or whoever it was like just a person coming up and it was one thing that whole time.
Yeah.
Instead, it like could have broken off at any moment and had one thing define their entire lives. But instead it was like many, many, many things. And like some of them we probably don't even know or understand because they were personal, right? You could have had your whole life like kind of hang at like being put in prison, and you didn't. But like many, many people do for
Yeah.
perfectly reasonable reasons. But I think that this is like one of the interesting things. I don't know. It's a very existential conversation. I think it's an important one to have.
It's interesting because I feel like you're making an argument for the existence of all of these random legal, like all of these random law journals that nobody reads, right? It's like it has to be a bunch of them, because if a bunch of them exist, then maybe at one point, some cream will rise to the crop and we'll have a different understanding of it. I think I don't know. I think first, I'm not sure if my life isn't defined by prison. It depends on who you talk to, and it depends on what day you talk to me. And I don't even mean that in necessarily a negative way. I just mean that in terms of a descriptive account of what my life is, right? I think it might also be attached to incarceration in that way. And some people will say things to me like, well, you have actually benefited from your incarceration. You make a point to talk about the way that you survived prison or the way that you dealt with prison. You have turned your time in prison into a research agenda. And my argument would be, I would very much like to not do those things. But we also understand that people who have served time in prison have also had to wear their incarceration in very much the same way I have. It's just that they couldn't make it their life's work for whatever reason. Maybe competency, maybe choice. They didn't really want to do it. Maybe they didn't want to revisit it. So I don't know. Maybe I would argue that in some real way, even as I get to tell my own story, the story that I tell is still trapped in incarceration. And that's one thing that's different. It's L.A. Paul got this book, she's a philosopher that teaches at Yale. And it seems obnoxious that I'm citing somebody that teaches at Yale. So I just want to preface this by saying when I read her book, she was at like Duke or something, or North Carolina. So like I didn't meet her as a Yalie, right? And I didn't read her book when she was at Yale, but the book is called Transformative Experience. And what she's arguing is that there are some experiences that fundamentally alter you in ways that you couldn't predict before experiencing. And so the paradigmatic example is like pregnancy, childbirth, right? Everybody could rate as much as they want about childbirth. And I make jokes about it all the time, saying I was there, I delivered 2 babies, right? But everybody knows I have no idea what it means to like deliver a child, right? Another one is when you have people who blind and then get their sight back. It's like one of those experiences that you just can't understand it unless you go through it. Well, I think like prison is the same experience. And what we don't admit is that in it being a transformative experience, it alters the way you see yourself and it alters the way people see you forever. And I think that is the thing that I try to emphasize, because it's true no matter who you are. None of my successes have made that thing less true. In fact, maybe the way in which I have accomplished my successes have made it even more so, because I have to publicly grapple with the idea of incarceration and what it's meant for me and others on a constant basis, where maybe I could just privately grapple with it had I came home and become a rocket scientist or, or a janitor, you know what I mean? Like whatever I could have become that would allow me to have some type of dignity.
So explain something to me when, like, what are the mechanics of the road from prison in Virginia to Yale Law School? It's not there's not a well-trodden path for that. When you apply to, I haven't looked at the Yale Law School application for a long time since I decided not to apply. But there's not like a path for prison for
What's funny is that if I find one of those, I'm gonna become a very rich man. In fact, I might just name my book "How to Go from Prison to Yale." I'm afraid to do that because I think a lot of people will think, okay, the first step is to go to prison, and then I feel like I would ruin a bunch of lives. But
damn it, Dwayne, that is such a good title, though. Yeah. That is like straight up like a Hollywood movie title. How to go from prison to Yale in 2 steps, or like something like that. Ben is frozen. I don't know what's going on, but I just love. I don't know. I just kind of love that. I think that but on the other hand, I do think it's exploitative of kind of just like the general. Right?
I think the problem with me writing that is I can't ham it up in that way. I mean, I think a lot of people get famous and they get wealthy and they get renowned if they're willing to tell that story and pretend like it was, some straight line. But as somebody that's trying to be an artist, I got to admit that, there was no direct path. It was coming out and fully intended on being a writer.
But you were like a good student. Even though you weren't, I thought you were. You told me that you were. Student. Were you lying to me?
Probably. But no, I mean, I was an excellent student. But a lot of excellent students don't get to Yale, and that's the thing of how.
No, but I mean, like, it's interesting to me. Like, you weren't like, there are some kids who have no interest in school and carjack a car, and like the whole life of crime becomes their path because they're like, school does not interest them. Like, it's not a wonder to me that you decided, like, knowing you, that you decided to be like, but it is kind of unusual, like, I guess, hi Ben, welcome back. Sorry,
I'm back. I don't even know when I dropped out.
I think that you dropped off like mid your question, but we were just talking about how Dwayne basically like kind of got on the path to like, I was saying that he was like a decent high school student and and he was like interested in reading and literature, and then like got mixed up in like this thing. And then, and so it's not crazy to me that like you decided to make the most of this time that you had.
Right. But I guess in part of what I would say is, I mean, I think that's true, but I also think part of what I would say in terms of like, what's the pathway for me from like prison to Yale? I said that I think a lot of students at Yale have more in common than we like to admit. But one of them is a sort of like absurd kind of curiosity about either how the world works generally or about how one specific thing works. And then I think an absurd belief that there is some degree of power or expertise you could obtain to make the things that you do make a difference in the world on some large scale. You know, like I think that people don't really necessarily apply to Yale Law School or any of those fancy places. It's just not a humble decision to make, right? And it's a strange thing to be like, we live in a society where like the elite spaces are like anti-humble, right? Like I wouldn't have applied to none of the schools that I applied to, which is like I got 3 felonies and I applied to all of the Ivy League law schools in the country. That is just fucking stupid. You know what I mean? Like it is no reason for me to believe in a country that treats people with criminal records the way that they do, that, you know, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, and Penn will all admit me, right? I didn't apply to Stanford because it's not Ivy League school anyway, and I wouldn't have lived on the East Coast.
You're
I mean, on the
such
West
an
Coast.
elitist. Jesus
know.
fucking Christ.
I know.
You're
saying,
such a dick. Oh my God.
I am admitting that, but I am saying that, like, you know, when we think about, first of all, I was saying it's an absurdity to apply to Ivy League schools, thinking that. So I was making that distinction about Stanford, not because I was dissing Stanford, but I was just making that distinction. I mean, it's still a great school. And I would have applied if I could stand living in the sun. My point, though, is that, you know, I think that if you accept that as a reality, that nobody applies to certain places unless they absurdly believe that somehow they deserve to be there, right? Then I think that the path from me from prison to Yale is one, I think filled with a belief in myself that wasn't warranted in any way, right? Whether you talk about being 16 and saying, you know, I decided to be a writer because I felt like I had to hold something, not because I could do it, but because I thought if I tell myself I'm gonna be a writer, then when I'm doing this 9-year bid, I have something to hold on to. And if you would have asked me, right, I was fortunate that I had nobody interrogating my decisions, because if you'd have said, well, what do you mean you're going to be a writer? I would have had no answer to that. If you'd have said, well, what are you going to produce? Are you going to write novels, short stories? I wouldn't even have had a clear way to articulate to you what a short story was, right? If you'd have said, are you going to be a poet? I'd have been like, I don't know. I just said I was going to be a writer and ran with it. And I think that I use that as an example for how I went from like prison to Yale Law School, which is I started to believe that things should be, after having like failed in a really public and like egregious way and hurt my family and hurt this victim and sort of tragic, like shattered all expectations of what my future would be. I just was like, fuck it, you know, and started to believe recklessly in what was possible for tomorrow. And those things allowed me to build up a kind of, you know, jacket that made Yale or law school period like seem possible.
And it's almost like the opposite of the imposter syndrome that we've talked about. It's like a very interesting reaction that, like, I don't know, that you do have a way of like, and I think it's completely amazing. It's not what I do. Like, I spent all of my time at YLS feeling like I did not belong there in a million different ways. And I feel like you're just like, here I am. Like, this is what's going on. And it was like, actually, when I remember when you got into when I like met you, we had like kind of like, I think that actually we kind of bonded over talking about literature. And no one else like was kind of reading books and like wanted to talk about that. And I was just like, oh, this is the thing. It reminds me. Yeah. I mean, I just think that you're very comfortable in your own skin.
But I don't want to pretend like I don't have the same insecurities as everybody else, though. But I just sort of think that like the bar to the elite institutions in this country is already really, really high. And the first hurdle I had to get over, having been like really, really low, is to believe that it was a place for me, one, in society. And then two, I didn't even dream about these places though, you know? So how do you imagine a place for yourself in a place that you never even dreamed about? And I think that that's one of the things we bonded over too, is, yeah, you know, in applying, you really do have to be able to say, I expect to be here, because it's just so much invested. And you have to be willing to be disappointed, but you really have to think you deserve to be there, or you just don't go through the work of applying. You don't go through the work of asking people to write letters of recommendations for you, right? But there was, I think, and this is what we bonded over, this even getting in, it's still this feeling of like, how do you deal with being in a place that you didn't even dream of beforehand. And the way I've always dealt with it is that I didn't dream of being in prison, right? So like like I could be like, well, I also didn't think that that was a possibility, right? And if I'm uncomfortable at Yale, it's almost as if I'm telling people that that I expected to be in prison, right? It's like what? So I was supposed to be more comfortable in prison. So I just say, I deal with being uncomfortable in both places because the worst one was my president, and I survived that being fully unprepared to be there, being fully uncomfortable, and I fit in though. I had friends, and it's like if I'm gonna have friends there, if I'm gonna fit in there, if I can't fit it at Yale or at University of Maryland or at the paint store where I worked, then that means I'm turning myself into a cliche because I know that I fit in prison, right? I know that I was able to like build relationships, build friendships, and so I can't allow that to be my like comfort zone for the rest of my life. That'd be like tragic.
No, this is exactly the authenticity that I think we bonded over, which was like, I had these parents who were like judges. And so ostensibly I had all of this privilege.
You
to,
had
like,
what whole time out? Your parents were judges? You said that, was that plural, or did you say I had this
no
parent?
judges. We've been over this. Yes, we've been over this. But my parents, no. My parents like went to like state law schools and like did not do that great and like worked their way up to these various positions. And my entire family is from this very kind of like, I don't want to say, I don't
You
like,
can- you
let's
can
just
say
say
it.
like double wide trailer, kind of like a lot of that kind of background in my family.
Yeah.
And so like they are very much the exceptions. And so, and they are very much like, even though they were judges and whatever, we're not like, and we've been over this, but we'll talk about it in a second. But they were like, this was not me going to an Ivy League school was like the first person in my family ever to like go to something like that, to like reach for something like that. They never did anything like that. That was a different level of my parents were not,
Yeah.
I don't want to like throw my parents into the bus because they're smart people, but like they didn't read the New Yorker, they didn't read Harper's or the Atlantic, they didn't read.
Somebody asked
There
me.
was nothing like that. There's no part of like the YLS culture that like was part of my blood. There was nothing. Like it was nothing.
It's really strange though, right? Somebody asked me the other day, they said on Twitter, maybe it was yesterday, they said, who gave you the foundation? Who did you read that gave you your understanding? No, they just said, who gave you your understanding of the criminal justice system? So me, I was like, my judge, the prosecutor, and the first lawyer that I had that we fired, right? And I'm looking at the answers that everybody else is saying, and they like, Cornel West and Michelle Alexander and Brian Stevenson. And I was thinking, damn. So it's a world in which people just found about this stuff yesterday, but also just found out about this stuff from people who nobody I know knows exists.
Oh
And
no,
I
my
think,
dad was a public defender, Dwayne. Like I interned in the public defender's office for like, he made me go there for like 3 summers to like do like eligibility interviews and stuff like that. Like it was like,
But I want to ask you about that. Like your introduction to your knowledge of the criminal justice system comes from this very granular process: a judge, a prosecutor, a defense lawyer. What is your relationship intellectually and emotionally with what happened to you and what you went through in the criminal justice system? Do you look back on that and say the prosecutor should behave differently, the judge should have behaved differently? Do you look back on that and say everybody was playing their role? Do you look
yeah,
back on that and say, I wish the policy had been different, but the people were fine? How do you emotionally relate to those interactions in retrospect?
yeah, so emotionally is sort of one thing. I mean, you just grow up and you learn that in some ways it was just a really, really challenging situation. And so something like I remember my lawyer, the one that we actually that actually represented me. So first, I pled guilty. So it's really little to do. Like it's a I mean, I confessed. So given my confession it's very little to do. Now, what my lawyer might have done, if my lawyer was like a PDS attorney, a question would have been asked somewhere. It was like, wait a minute, tell me what happened. Nobody ever asked me this. Tell me what happened from the moment you got arrested and to the moment that you first arrived in the cell. Okay, now hold up. Describe this interview again. Did they know how old you were? Okay, did they call your parent? But wait a minute. And this was 1996. So it's unlikely that the confession would have been thrown out. But there's a world in which a defense attorney would say, well, first step is to see if we could get this confession thrown out. And then the second step is to see what kind of plea bargain we can negotiate. And I pled guilty without a guarantee of how much time I would be sentenced to. So when I stood before the judge, I could have been sentenced to life. So what I think that means for me is on an emotional level, depending on the day of the week, I respond very differently, right? Because as an attorney, I don't think that I should ever put my client in a situation where he is facing life in prison totally in the hands of a judge. And I think that the only reason that I wasn't suffering from extreme anxiety is because I just didn't even understand really what was actually possible. And intellectually, it's different because I sort of just recognized that we don't have one criminal justice system. We have fucking 1,000 criminal justice systems, right? And so that intellectually, I think about my experience and I recognize that it's like a microcosm, but it gives me some lens to think about how some research I might do or some questions I might try to answer could help bring light to some aspect of the system. And so, for instance, I work on parole, and I'm sort of one of those people that's like a generalist. You know, I do all of these things, but I don't do any of them deeply enough, really, for me to say that you should respect me as like the end all source on this issue. And it's not a lot of people that do parole anyway for people that's incarcerated, and the people that the lawyers that represent people. I mean, they tend to be like public defenders, essentially. They got small practices. They're not making hundreds and hundreds of $1,000s a year. And they're doing stuff just because they really committed and dedicated to it. Or they're doing it because they could get work done and making a little bit of money for each case. But the point is, like some of my research, I might say, I'm thinking about the way parole operates in different states. And I'm trying to figure out how do you do two things. First, how do I still advocate for the release of people that I know in Virginia, representing them on parole? Like this year, 2019, 2020, over the past 12 months, I got 2 people out on parole that I did time with. So to me, that's like a huge accomplishment, right? Mm-hmm. Especially when you got a state where the parole grant rate is hovering around 8%, right? So I say that's a huge accomplishment.
And just, you know, Virginia's parole system is something I have a little bit of experience with. They abolished it, I forget what year, but
94.
94. And so it's only available to people who were sentenced before the abolition, if I recall the law correctly.
Yep.
And and among the people that it's available to, which is a relatively small percentage of the inmate population, it's actually granted 8% of the time. And so you're talking about like actually winning a parole in Virginia is a significant litigation accomplishment.
Although, but like what's interesting about it is all of that stuff is true, right? But then also there is no record that gets kept made in Virginia. So it's not like New York where when you go in front of the hearing, in fact, I went to the hearing to talk to the members of the parole board, but the person that's incarcerated talks to a proxy at a parole board in Virginia. So they don't even actually get to talk to the actual members. And even when I go with the family members, I get to talk to one member, not all of the members. And so I have to say, well, but my goal is to get this person out of prison. So I'm gonna work through the system as it exists. But then I think when I think about myself as a scholar, I say I got to figure out how to actually work on an issue to say, thinking about administrative law, to say how do we actually put pressure on states to make the administrative rules within certain contexts more robust. Like in Virginia, I mean in New York, where I represented somebody while I was in law school, I helped my professor represent somebody, and we got this guy who did like 35 years. And she went and Issa Cola Houseman went and represented him in front of the third department, and like won on appeal. The thing is, it was actually a series of steps and a series of state regulations and state laws that allowed an appeal procedure to be in process. That doesn't exist in Virginia at all. So when I think about how my experience affects the way I think about policy, like as a litigator, I wouldn't have never chose Virginia to be a place to work. It's nothing there, you know, like it's all soft advocacy, right? It's like nothing robust. It's nothing that you could actually point to and could be duplicated. So if I was a young attorney coming out, I would never go to Virginia to do this work. I would say, well, wait a minute, what state can I have the most impact? I would throw around some words that I learned in law school. Talk about, I would be like, well, if I want to scale it up, you know, I would like make some shit up, right? And then I would end up in California or in New York. And so I think my personal experiences make me recognize that these places like Virginia are important, and then seeing the ways they are important and how they differ from some places that have better laws, then I can think about how I could do scholarship that sort of teases that out for people and tries to imagine how we would go about addressing this issue by changing some of the laws in Virginia so that it's a more robust appeal process. Or, you know, you imagine, I mean, New York has had parole the entire time, right? Virginia hasn't. They just have it for people that got locked up in 1994, and yet the parole board doesn't have the capacity to do in-person interviews. I mean, it's just like that is actually a academic question to answer. How
parole
is
boards also always struck me as total bullshit. Like, is that not like I mean, like they're better than not having a parole board, like not having the option of kind of re-reviewing, but like
parole boards are like human beings though.
Yeah.
So human beings are mostly total bullshit too. And that's the like, so like in Virginia, you know, recently they let this guy go. He got locked up when he was 15 or 16. He's been locked up for 35 years. He killed the cop, right? Now, it is really hard. I've tried to get COs and people in the admin to write letters for guys that's locked up. This guy had been locked up for 35 years. He had all the things that you needed to get like parole. He was the prime candidate. And the board had been saying no to people I knew. So I knew that the board was like at least approximating some legitimacy within a world where only 8% of people get a yes. This guy gets granted parole, right? And immediately, his family from New York is they doing articles in like the Richmond Times Dispatch. They're criticizing the parole board. And so we could say parole boards ain't shit, but reality is like people ain't shit, right? Because it is the response of the people that then puts more pressure on the parole board. And it's much easier for any of those agencies that exist to just say no, because the people that you're saying no to, society's decided don't matter. So my new thing is I don't even want to criticize any parole board anymore, because I recognize, and if you read some of these articles in the Richmond Times Dispatch, the legislators, it becomes low-hanging fruit for legislators who never cared about the issue before, never met the guy that got granted parole, never talked to anybody who knows him, right? They say, well, I could get some print and guarantee that I'll get reelected, because I know that the people who vote for me actually they're happy with the parole board saying no even more often, you know. So it's like, so that's me granularly actually, like, how do I frame my critique of the parole board is based on my experience talking to them.
But like, so, I get it. Like, it's humans all the way down, but like parole boards in particular have like risk aversion standards in which they like don't want to get like dragged.
Name one person you know that wants to be on a parole board.
No, you're right. No, you're right. So, no one wants to be.
Hey, anyone who wants to appoint me to a parole board, I would love to be on a parole board.
We're gonna get you because I'm convinced, like in Virginia, it's 2 paid employees and then it's like 2 or 3 volunteers, right? But my point though is I'm also convinced that one of these jobs are pure nepotism, right? But they're only like pure and unabashed nepotism frequently because nobody actually wants to do it. And then you have a state like Virginia, yes, where you get somebody, the head of the parole board was a public defender. Like they would about their business. And I think what happens is, I'd never heard a classmate, everybody wants to change the world. Everybody wants to change the world, right? I never heard a classmate, and I never said this shit myself either, right? I would love to be the mayor of a small city. You know, like I would love to get appointed to the parole board and be able to, people who like, let's fight mass incarceration. I've never heard it in my life to say, you know, I want to work on, like, I want to go into, when I go and work for the governor, I want to go and work for the governor so that I can have a say in who gets appointed to the parole board. And think about how much like power people who
I
make those
do.
decisions actually have.
I do that one and the Empire State Development Corporation. Sorry, this is like a property thing, but like all of how all of property is like distributed and everything else in New York.
I didn't say property.
I know. You're just talking about criminal stuff.
Spoken like
but
a,
I'm like,
spoken like
you
a
know,
Yale law student.
there's law outside. There's law outside criminal law, Dwayne. Like, and like, anyways, but all of it is like, there are just like elements of bullshit all the way down, but whatever. Without getting, wow, that was like, we've gotten like kind of cynical about the law all of a sudden, but I think that
Let's talk about poetry.
And I should say not us, because Benjamin wants to be on the parole board.
Yeah.
And I want to appear in front of him, so we good.
And I'm basically like, let's burn it all down. I think this is like rotten from the core. This is great.
I got interested in the criminal justice system in Virginia back when I was writing editorials for the Washington Post. And the reason was the 21-day rule.
That shit is crazy.
It's fucking crazy. So the 21-day rule, for those of you who've never heard of it, is a rule in Virginia criminal procedure that says 21 days after a conviction becomes final, the record closes and newly discovered evidence can't be admitted or acknowledged, even if it's dispositive evidence of innocence. The record is closed. And I was fascinated by this rule, and I became I just, became interested in, all right, if this is real, right? If we believe that the record is related to innocence, there have got to be victims of this. There have got to be people who, are prevented from bringing evidence of innocence to courts. And it's got to actually matter if we believe that process is related to substantive outcome. So I called a friend who was a criminal defense lawyer in Virginia. He'd actually represented John Allen Muhammad. And he said to me, there's one guy you need to talk to about the 21-day rule. It's a guy named Steve Benjamin in Richmond. So I called this guy I'd never heard of, Steve Benjamin. And I said, look, this rule is so crazy. There've got to be victims of this. Who are they? And he told me about a gentleman. So it took one call to find a victim of this. The victim I found was a guy named Jeff Cox, who was sentenced to life plus 50 years, life plus 20, life plus 50 for killing an old woman in Richmond. And by the time I took a look at the case, it was completely obvious that he had had nothing to do with it. But he couldn't get any of the evidence in. And the only reason his case was litigatable at all was because a jailhouse lawyer had preserved his rights. And this is a bank robber who I've stayed in touch with over the years and who got parole eventually, by the way. And Jeff eventually got released. It took a lot of work by a lot of people. And, he eventually got out. And I am convinced to a moral certainty that if you have rules that freaking crazy, there are a lot of victims. Jeff is just the one that we could find easily with one or two phone calls.
I mean, and the other part of it, though, about the 21 days, it also means that you can't go back in front of a judge to get resentenced.
Right.
And so that means that now we recognize that mass incarceration is a thing, and we recognize that people have gotten these strange and absurd sentences. And a lot of prosecutors have actually changed the way they think about things, but it's actually no mechanism to get back in front of a judge. And so you actually have state laws preventing, the kind of reflection that I think drives democracy, the kind of reflection that drives our ability to be on one track and then make different decisions. And so I think, I think Virginia law is an interesting case study for thinking about how people come up with decisions that's just disastrous. And what would it mean to like dig in and find out how the 21-day rule came to be? Like, what is that? Was it a football fan and their team lost, 28-21? Like, I mean, like, what is the significance of 21 days? And you realize that a lot of these numbers have no significance at all. They were just like pulled out of the air and they destroy people's lives.
But like, this is like, how can you not watch this and not have like disdain? Like, I'm not trying to sound like a total communist, which is exactly what I'm not actually. But like, I do think that most people mean well who like interpret this law and who want like, or interpret the 21-day law or like whatever law it is. But like, why it gets put at that level is like so arbitrary.
But I guarantee you, I also don't want to be a state legislator. I mean, one of the questions too is how do we support people who are state legislators? Is one of our classmates who went and who's a man, I can't think of his name right now.
It's probably for the best.
Who's the two senators in Connecticut? It's Coons and Blumenthal. So Blumenthal's kid, Matt. So Matt Blumenthal is a state representative, right? But it's one of those things too that as a state representative, he's privy to all of the conversations about criminal justice reform. Like,
he's not just privy to that, he's privy to all of the ramifications of that on his like, and all of the politics and how that like impacts his various like finances for his campaign. Like,
well,
it's like
not Senator Blumenthal. No, I'm talking about State Representative Blumenthal, who probably got a salary of like $50K or something like that. So I'm just saying, like, on a state level, the state representative who he might have ambitions to become a senator, his dad's a senator. But like right now, Matt, he is the person that's having the conversations with the 5 or 6 people that's on the Judiciary Committee that's trying to push a vast change. And one of the things I think that is important for me to imagine how scholars do this is to actually become fluent in local politics to the degree that, if we want to talk about the 21-day rule, we cannot be talking about federal law and imagine how the 21-day rule came to pass. We actually have to be talking to the Matt Blumenthals of the world. And we actually have to, like, again, if I become, just talking about on a state level, on a local level, if I become so cynical that I devalue the work that I know I'm not willing to do. Like, I'm a poet. You're not going to have me like trying to pass bills. You're not going to have me try to build relationships with all of these old white dudes that I feel like every time I walk in the room are going to be looking at me crazy. Like, that's just not the thing you're going to ask me to do. And so since I know that's not the thing I'm going to do, then I have to figure out a way to support somebody like Matt or like Porter, who's my local rep, right? Who is just like a grandmother, who's like, nah, this is not working out right. And so I'm gonna become a politician to try to change this. And again, Connecticut criminal law might be fucked up for the next 7 years.
Hold on, you're gonna become a politician? You're gonna be the poet politician?
No, I said I am not going to be a politician. And because I am not going to be a politician, I need to find a way. I don't think I have it in me, honestly, because it's a wretched job. And
it is a wretched job. I don't know that you would be great for it, but I do think that you would be good at it in a weird way.
I don't know, but
you're authentic, which is like one of the only things that I think is the good quality in politicians. But like, yeah.
Name a national politician that you think is authentic.
I'll tell you one.
Yeah, I'll tell you one. Obama? I don't know.
No,
do you think Obama's?
And it relates directly to this Virginia criminal procedure issue. Tim Kaine. Let me tell you a story about Tim Kaine. This is when he was Attorney General of Virginia, and he was getting ready to run for governor. Or maybe he was lieutenant governor at the time. He was getting ready to run for governor, and he was too liberal to be elected statewide in Virginia at the time, as you'll remember. And because of this crazy issue, not the 21-day rule, but the related issue of procedural defaults in Virginia criminal appeals, I had advanced in a series of editorials this idea of creating a procedure by which people who had defaulted their appeals through error of counsel could get them back without forfeiting all their habeas rights.
Right.
And like, it was something that like 5 of us cared about. And I'd kind of campaigned for it on the Washington Post editorial page. And eventually the Indigent Defense Commission in Virginia produced a model bill that they were going to try to urge. And I called all the campaigns of the people who were thinking about running for governor, including the incumbent governor, who was non-committal about it in a kind of Mark Warner sort of way. And the attorney general, I forget his name, who was opposed to it because it might give some felons some additional right to assert. And then I sent it to Lieutenant Governor Tim Kaine, and he called me personally. He'd read the thing in some detail. He's actually a very talented lawyer. He's he'd done, habeas work, and he'd read it. He had thoughtful critiques of it. And he gave me, this was just nothing in this for him getting ready to run statewide in Virginia. And he gave me thoughtful comments on it and told me he supported it in concept, but had a couple of reservations. And here they were, and they were at the level of they should cross out this word and replace it with this word. And I thought to myself, wow, that's pretty freaking authentic, you get and so I have always had an admiration for Tim Kaine. I know people don't admire his role as a vice presidential nominee for Hillary Clinton, but I think he's a stand-up guy and an authentic guy.
And I mean, the vice president, I'm not gonna hold him accountable for that decision. I'm gonna blame somebody else for that. But no, I mean, I actually think that it might be more stories like that about politicians, and I actually wish that we had. We don't have a print space, and we don't necessarily, like, the people who hear those stories maybe don't even be in positions. They aren't frequently in positions to tell the stories and to tell them eloquently. And so some of the I think stasis that we have in the system is based on the distance between the public's awareness of who is fighting for certain types of policy change, maybe, and a willingness the ability to make that known more generally. You wanted me to read something, Kate?
Yeah, but before you do, we got a question from Lisa P., who is not a puppet.
Cool.
Hi, Dwayne. I really appreciate you being on today. I'm very moved by your story. I'm wondering if you're willing to share your worst day, and whether it's being sentenced or when you first reported or being in prison, and not how you got through it, because you just get through it by getting through it. But I'm just curious to know what, like, that day that if you maybe could have taken your life, you would have, but you chose not to.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I mean, given the last thing you said, I think it has to be somehow related to incarceration, because I've never really been like that, like post incarceration. And I would say this: this is my worst day, and it's not even one day; it's 8 days, right? And one of the things, and so it's a number of factors that create a sort of worst day moment for this. At first, the last time I got in a fight was in 2nd grade, and I beat the shit out of dude. But that was the last win. So you got to figure I'm 16, and my last win was like in 2nd grade, right? So this is just like not okay, right? So I get locked up, and I had several losses between 2nd grade and 11th grade, like 27. I was like 1 in 27, and I go get sent to the juvenile detention center, and I'm in Virginia, and I'm not from Virginia, and I'm not really getting bullied, but it's attention because I talk too much, and so I got a few near scuffles, and I'm reminded of the fact that I don't know if I really know how to fight, and then I get transferred to another juvenile detention center, and then somebody imagines that they're bullying me, but they're only bullying me because it's not clear what I'm gonna do. So then before I have a before I'm forced to respond in some way, I get sent to the jail. I get sent to the jail, and I'm 16, and my co-defendant is upstairs. And at the time, they only had one juvenile unit. So since they only had one juvenile unit, they didn't want me and him to be together. They put me in this place called the R cells, and the R cells were in the basement of the Fairfax County Jail. And they put me in there, put me in a cell. There's no window in the cell. It was also February 21st, and I distinctly remember the day because sometimes you remember stuff like that. But it was February 21st. They put me in this cell. And this is in the middle, the blizzard of 1997. This is the time in DC when this is going on. So they put me in the hole. They put me in this cell with no windows. Didn't give me a mattress. Didn't give me a blanket. Didn't give me a pillow. I had on my court clothes, which were like a pair of khakis that were ill-fitting and a sweater that was kind of too big. And they didn't let me take a shower for 8 days. So for 8 days in a row, and it's dead of February when it was freezing, right, in the middle of a blizzard, 8 days in a row, I had to sleep on a concrete slab with, I just had like a half a little blanket, but I had no sheets. I had no real blanket. I had no mattress. I had no pillow. And I think that was probably the worst. And the only, if it was some good thing about it, the only good thing about it was that at the very beginning, I had to figure out if I was going to make it through this, because the guards would come by and I would say, listen, I don't have a mattress, and I could show them my cell and be like, yo, I don't have a mattress. And they would just say, all right, I bring you one, and wouldn't bring me one. And I only got one because, 8 days, I've never been that long. And I don't think I've been that long. I haven't, that's the longest time I've ever went without bathing. But when a nurse came, because they had finally decided to just put me in population, the nurse, like when they came to sort of officially check me into the prison or whatever, the nurse wouldn't actually do an examination because of how I smelled. She was like, and I was like, well, I don't have a mattress, and you're not going to criticize me for stinking, because not only do I not have a mattress, I don't have a pillow, and it's cold in here, and I've been begging for 8 days. And so she was the reason why they ended up giving me a mattress. They giving me my property and let me buy stuff from commissary. But and then I stayed in the hole for 2 more days, and then they sent me to population. So if I was thinking about my worst moment around that experience, I would say it was those like 8 days, because it was the floor. Well, it was some version of, and it ultimately probably was my floor, but it was some version of what the floor is like, and it was one of those things where psychologists and scholars talk about the effects of solitary confinement. But it's again, the idea of it being a transformative experience, something that you can't even understand unless you've actually been there. It's a way in which having to go through that at the very beginning gave me, I don't know, something that I could lean on, but that was the worst, because yeah, 24 hours is a long time, and you multiply that by 8 without really being able to talk to anybody, and then also having to do with just the environmental deprivations. I think that was rough.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that's actually staggering. Like, it kind of makes me like deeply sad that you had to like go through that. Like, I know you and I love you as a friend and a person. And like, that's just like 24 hours, like times 8 is a long time. That's like a very long time. And there is you kind of like bring up this human aspect of like a nurse who kind of like broke it up, but like, I don't know. It just like, I don't know. They just like,
because you got to understand, they were feeding me. So 3 times every day, somebody saw I didn't have a mattress, and they just chose not to do their job. And I was young.
Well, like, did they choose not to do their job, or was their job to keep depriving you of a mattress?
No, I just think, that's just, it's fucking mundane. You know what I mean? It's not even, I wish I could believe that they were even cruel. And it's just, it's just a world that we're like, mistreatment is so normal that that you could walk past somebody and say, I'll get to it, and not get to it. And it's absolutely inexcusable, but I would feel better if they were cruel. but I'm certain that they don't even remember my name. You know, I'm certain that it was like, I wish it was cruel, but I didn't even have a kind of case that they didn't know who I was. And I looked 16. You know, I mean, I looked like their kids' age. I didn't look like
Yeah,
I was
you
like,
were
you
you
know,
were healthy
Mhm.
enough. You weren't,
yeah.
nothing was like, yeah.
Yeah, I was like 120 pounds. Like really, I wasn't even the kind. I didn't even pose the kind of threat that would have inspired cruelty in anybody except somebody who was just looking for somebody to victimize, right? Like I just wasn't even a person that would inspire them to intentionally mistreat me. It was just, you know,
There's a book by one of by this amazing author, Amy Bach, who has I think I've matched you up with
yeah,
her at some point, Dwayne, who does a book called Ordinary Injustice, which is about kind of the day-to-day, kind of like completely passive people just kind of live their lives and think they're doing their
right,
jobs type of like parts of the justice system that like end up not actually being justice. And she kind of does the triangle, starting with like the judge, and then like the public defender, and then going over to the DA, and like doing this kind of like, and she now has the Measures for Justice is like her organization, and it's based in Rochester, New York. But relatedly, I would just kind of like to bring you back to like your writing and kind of some of the things that brought you out of prison, and have you do a couple of readings of whatever you would like, whatever you're in the mood to read. I told you it
I,
was totally up to you.
yeah. I've read a couple joints. I don't know, right? I mean, writing is just a thing I do. And I think, but I also think it's a thing you do to chase like some kind of permanence beyond the moment. And it's cool because it forces you to try to figure out the moment and maybe push past it. But I read two joints. I read one because we drinking whiskey for breakfast. My liver awash in all but the dregs of a charred oak cast, shadowed as blood, soaked in barley's amber, dim as a cell in the hole. Survive brackish prison water only to become collateral. The things that haunt me still drown now, friends say, in nearly 50 pounds of brick cube rot gut, spiritus frumenti. A gallon of whiskey weighs 8 pounds, and I am riven, and all this becomes a man confessing. And I'll read one more. This other joint is called it's cool because I'm working on I
I
turned
love
my book.
that.
Thank you. I turned my book into a solo show, and so it gives me something to do, and so I force myself to learn stuff by heart, and and also it's new, so you should get the book, and then you should check out the show when it's my new ambition is to be on Broadway. I shouldn't say it out loud, but like that's the one, because again, it's just as absurd as saying I'm going to law school, right?
No,
Um,
it's exactly what you should be saying out loud.
yeah. But yes, I've been working on them. So I'm gonna read the I'm gonna read the way the piece opens up. So name a song that tells a man what to expect after prison, that explains Occam's razor, yet still a suspect after prison. Blood history. The things that abandon you get remembered different. As precise as the English language can be, with words like penultimate and perseverate, there is not an exact combination of sounds that describe only that leaving. Once, drinking and smoking with buddies, a friend asked if I longed for a father. Had he said wanted, I would have dismissed him in the way that youngins dismiss it all. A shrug, sarcasm, a sharp jab to the stomach, laughter. But he said longing, and in a different place, I might have wept. Said once my father lived with us and then he didn't. And it fucked me up so bad that I didn't think about his leaving until I held my own son in my arms and only now speak on it. A man who drank whiskey like water said there is no word for father where he comes from, not like we know it. There The word father is the same as the word for listen. The blunts we passed around let us abandon our tongues. Not that much though. But what if the old head knew something? And if you have no father, you can't hear straight. Years later, another friend wondered why I didn't name my own son after my father. As if he ain't know. Some things turn your life into a prayer. The gods will certainly answer.
Wow.
I love that.
We're going to leave it there because I got nothing to say after that.
No, me neither.
Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys. I enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Thanks. And thanks everybody who listened. I appreciate y'all taking the time, taking an hour to listen to me. So guys, take care.
You're the
So,
best.
Kate, we don't know who we have tomorrow, right?
You can head out, Dwayne.
All right, cool.
See ya.
We're gonna tomorrow's gonna be a bit of a mystery, but
Yep.
we will figure it out and announce it over the course of the day. I thought we were gonna have a Baroque cellist friend of mine, but she can't do it. So we're gonna come up with something else. Until then, which is to say 5:00 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow. Kate, what do we say?
If you can't have fun, in lieu of fun, come have fun with us. Come hang out with us.
Yeah,
Come
there
have
you
fun.
go. Because you can't have
Come
fun.
hang out with us.
Right.
Not the
All
fun.
right.
No fun.
No
Absolutely
fun.
no fun.
All right. See you tomorrow.
Bye, Ben.